It was supposed to be the perfect form of tank armor, a technology that would make Russia's tanks practically invulnerable to all but the most earth-shattering of weapons. An active protection system that would sit at the forefront of tank technology was supposed to make Russia's massive mechanized fleet the strongest that any nation could field. But it hasn't worked out like that. After 30 years of research into invincible armor, Russia's tanks are meeting their match. The irony, they're being undone by disposable drones that cost a fraction of a single shell. That armor is called Arena M, and Russia expected it to change everything. Arena M has existed in some incarnation or another for decades, but it came to the forefront during the recent years of the Ukraine war. And all too often, Western commentators found themselves reporting on the supposed latest and greatest advancements in the armor system that were going to make it impossible for Ukraine's anti-tank weapons to stop Russia's mechanized hordes. Take David Hambling's piece on Arena M for Forbes, written in August 2024. Hambling posed the question of whether the system would make Russia's tanks invulnerable to Ukraine's drones and provided some details on what it's supposed to be capable of doing. Russia had started installing its new Arena M, which is marketed as an Active Protection System, or APS, onto most of its new T-90M tanks, which almost seems like overkill. The T-90M already has armor that combines metal, ceramics, and composite materials, Hambling notes. But the tank's problem in Ukraine has always been that armor that's equivalent to almost 3 feet of solid steel isn't all that effective against Ukrainian drones that attack from above. Arena M is supposed to change all of that. The basic concept behind the armor is that it essentially transforms a tank into a mechanized unit that's capable of intercepting most incoming threats. The APS is supposed to combine an array of radar sensors installed on the tank's outside with a computer control system and launch tubes for interceptor rounds that can be fired against incoming anti-tank rounds and drones. According to Forbes, the system is supposed to be able to track and fire upon any threat that's moving at speeds of between 150 and 1,500 miles per hour. Its radar is also meant to be so good that it can filter out false targets, such as birds and small projectiles that can't harm a tank, so that the interceptor rounds are focused on whatever is approaching. Once that threat comes within the Arena M's 160-foot range, an interceptor round is launched and the threat is eliminated. It sounds clever, and if it worked, it would be. Russia has been trying to develop this armor since the Soviet era, and it aims to use Arena M to provide between 270-degree to full 360-degree protection for its tanks. As we rolled into 2025, even more rumors started flying about the system and how Russia was implementing it. By February of this year, the first images of Russian T-90Ms equipped with the revolutionary new armor started making the rounds. These images weren't from some showroom in Russia. They appeared to come out of Ukraine, suggesting that the Arena M was finally finished and that Russia was deploying it to counter the many threats that Ukraine poses to its tanks. About a month later, Militani reported on a video published by Russia that showed the Arena M in action. The carefully directed sequence seems to show the tank intercepting an anti-tank grenade flying parallel to the ground, along with a missile of some description in the upper hemisphere. Russia was trying to send a message. No matter what weapons Ukraine uses, the Arena M can intercept them. Militani suggested that, if the video footage was true to the Arena M's capabilities, Russia's system may be advanced enough to intercept Ukraine's Javelin anti-tank missiles. However, it also offered the caveat that the aerial missile that the Arena M blows out of the sky in the footage is approaching at a gentle angle. A Javelin takes a far straighter approach, so the jury was still out on the system. Russia was still very keen on making the Arena M seem like the next big thing in tank defense though. In August, Army Recognition reported that Russia had started to equip its T-72s with Arena M, along with its new T-90Ms. That work actually started the previous October, the outlet claims, and it suggests that the Arena M system can be retroactively fitted to the Soviet-era tanks that Russia is increasingly using during the Ukraine war. So, this is all terrible news for Ukraine, right? An armor system that can take out the weapons Ukraine uses to destroy Russia's tanks would open the door for more successful mechanized assaults being conducted by Russia. But if that's the case, the question has to be asked, why aren't we seeing Russia's tanks steamrolling over Ukraine now that they have Arena M installed? The answer is simply that Arena M is nowhere near what Russia tries to claim it to be. and that isn't coming from Western sources. A Russian military analyst has burst his country's APS bubble to reveal that the decades-long effort to make Arena M viable has resulted in a system that's ineffective at combating the biggest threat that Russia's tanks face in Ukraine: drones. Defense Blog reports that the analyst, named Viktor Murakovsky, has provided a detailed technical analysis of Arena M that reveals it isn't fit for the purpose that Russia requires in Ukraine. The outlet notes that the most recent version of the system was supposed to have expanded Arena M's range of targets to include small unmanned aerial vehicles and the first-person view or FPV drones that Ukraine is using to destroy Russia's tanks in their thousands. However, Arena M is failing at this critical task because of massive failures in its radars. The radar system, which is installed all over a tank that utilizes Arena M, is hopeless at detecting and classifying small targets that have low visibility, Murakovsky says. These include drones that are made using radio-transparent materials such as plastic, which accounts for a lot of Ukraine's drones. Worse yet, the analyst claims, Arena M is also unable to separate small airborne objects from random ground clutter at short distances. Given that the interceptors the tank fires off seem to be limited to 160 feet, per Hambling's Forbes report, that poor performance at short range makes a massive difference to the survivability of an Arena M-equipped tank when confronted with a drone. The problem, the analyst notes, is the nature of the technology used to design the radar. According to Murakovsky, methods traditionally used in air defense radars, including Doppler detection and moving target indication, are ineffective against UAVs with a very small radar cross-section and low velocity, particularly when they operate close to terrain features or at very low altitude, Defense Blog reports. It seems that, in creating its ultra-modern armor, Russia found itself stuck in decades-old thinking. A radar system that can't detect drones is no good for tanks to which drones pose the highest threat. The craziest thing about all of this is that the Arena M should be capable of tracking incoming drones, even if the system wasn't originally designed to do so. Militani shares a quote from a military vehicle historian named Andrei Tarasyenko, who says that the low visibility claim might not be the root of the Arena M's problems. Okay, the radar can't detect an FPV drone, small and slow moving, even at close range, Tarasyenko claims. But it doesn't have to, because a drone without a payload poses no threat to a tank, and the payload will always be a heat or something similar, which necessarily contains metal. They can't detect not just the drone itself, but even a drone with a heat warhead. Heats are anti-tank warheads. If the Arena M worked as it's supposed to work, most drones that pose a threat would be blasted out of the sky. So, Russia has one of two problems with its supposedly invulnerable APS. It's either incapable of detecting drones, though it can at least detect other objects. That means it's unable to deal with the weapon that's doing most of Ukraine's tank-related damage, but could at least potentially deal with javelins and rocket-propelled grenades. Or the radars are so broken that they can't even pick up on the very things that they were supposed to be able to detect years ago. Incredibly, the situation that Murakovsky describes is the preferable of the two. Either way, Arena M can't do a thing to stop Ukraine from taking out tanks with its drones. What Russia has ended up doing is spending literal decades investing millions of dollars into a tank defense system that's incapable of defending the country's tanks from the biggest threat that they face in Ukraine. We don't have specifics when it comes to the scale of the investment. Russia hasn't revealed anything. And, as United 24 media suggests, these faults may be the reason why we haven't seen the Arena M deployed en masse in Ukraine. Though Russia is reportedly building the system into its tanks, it hasn't sent enough of them into Ukraine to be operationally effective, the outlet notes. There has to be a reason for that. And the reason could be that Arena M is an expensive boondoggle that would be exposed the moment Ukraine's drones start penetrating its supposedly invincible defenses. Deprived of the APS that's supposed to protect them, Russia's tank operators have been forced to improvise with haphazard defenses that they hope will repel Ukraine's drone hordes. Russian troops continue to rely on crude, improvised methods, welded cages, metal screens, and anti-drone sheds mounted on tanks to absorb drone strikes, United 24 media reports. We've seen plenty of examples of these types of defenses, which are often mockingly referred to as cope cages. Russia has become so reliant on these often bizarre forms of makeshift tank defense that its manufacturers have even started displaying cope cages at military exhibitions. That's according to the War Zone, which said that these solutions to the Ukrainian drone problem were starting to come to the forefront of military exhibitions in 2023. Cope cages don't have much to prevent the tank massacre we've seen in Ukraine, but we'll get back to that later in the video. The real issue here is that Russia's forces are being forced to improvise defensive solutions because the technology that is supposed to be able to protect their mechanized units in Ukraine isn't viable. And according to United 24 media, that simple fact reveals the true state of Russia's defense industrial base. It's hardly a revelation to Russia that Ukraine's drones represent the biggest threat that Russian forces face in Ukraine. Those drones were responsible for up to 80% of Ukraine war casualties by April, Army Technology reports. Yet, despite knowing the specific technology it needs to counter, Russia's defense industrial base can't come up with any solutions. Reliable and automated counter-drone systems still don't exist, regardless of Russia's investment into technologies like the Arena M, and drones are only getting more advanced as time goes on. So, how much are Russian companies spending on anti-drone technology? According to BNE IntelliNews, the figure was somewhere around the $500 million mark in 2024, which puts Russia second behind only the US in terms of how much it's spending to come up with an answer to the drone problem. BNE IntelliNews suggests that as many as 80% of Russia's civilian enterprises have installed some form of drone defense system as of spring of 2025. The same outlet claims that Russia's anti-drone market will grow by 23% per year between 2025 and 2030 and will be worth around $1.5 billion at the end of those 5 years. And still, despite all of this spending, Russia has no real solution for dealing with Ukraine's drones. We see that in the rampant success of Ukraine's deep strike strategy against Russia, and now we see it in the utter failure of the Arena M to counter the one weapon Russia really needs it to be able to handle. If anything, Ukraine is expanding its long-range strikes on Russian energy infrastructure despite all of this investment into anti-drone solutions. We published a video on Ukraine's new strategy that's leaving Russia exposed and outgunned, so check it out to learn more. Now, coming up with adequate defenses against drones isn't just a Russia problem, it's an everybody problem, and Ukraine struggles with it too. In a research paper published by Security and Defense Quarterly, Mohammad Zeid Shari explores the many limitations that both sides of the Ukraine war face when coming up with adequate defenses. Current technologies simply aren't capable of dealing with the sheer volume of assaults being conducted using FPV drones. The rising frequency of assaults by FPV drones highlights the inadequacies of current technologies, including RF jammers, handheld gun jammers, lasers, high-power microwaves, and trained eagles in thwarting and neutralizing illegal drones, Zeid Shari said. The researcher is writing from Ukraine's perspective when it comes to dealing with FPV drones. However, the exact same argument applies to Russia, and it highlights another issue with Arena M that isn't to do with the failing of its radars. Even with those radars in place, Ukraine has a lot of drones on the battlefield. According to the Kyiv Post, Ukraine's drone industry now has the capacity to build up to 10 million unmanned vehicles annually, assuming it receives the proper investment. Just how effective could Arena M be against such a massive volume of drones, even if it worked properly? There are only so much launch tubes that Russia could install into one of its tanks, meaning that its mechanized units would soon run out of interceptors. The argument could be that even taking out a few drones before your tank gets destroyed is better than taking out none at all. But that doesn't change the end result of another tank being burned to the ground, which is what Russia is trying to avoid during its mechanized assaults. So, what is Russia left with? After spending 30 years and however many dollars on Arena M, its most effective anti-drone measures are often still its most primitive. Cope cages, though they can be bypassed or destroyed with enough accuracy, can cause the waste of drones. Nets across military convoy roads can also help. Electronic warfare is still better than interceptor projectiles that can't launch because the Arena M's radar doesn't pick up on drones. So, as we said before, the Arena M is worthless. Russia knows that as well as anyone, which is why it isn't deploying the armor in any notable capacity outside of the occasional tank and promotional videos designed to hide how badly it fails when confronted with drones. All of this means that Russia's terrible tank situation isn't going to be solved by an armor system that's been in development hell for 3 decades and shows no sign of rearing its head anytime soon. And when we say terrible, that's exactly how Russia's tanks are faring in Ukraine. On January 26, the UK Defence Journal said that Russia had lost an estimated 10,000 tanks since the beginning of the Ukraine invasion. That's 10,000 tanks in about 35 months, which amounts to losses of approximately 285 tanks per month. It hasn't got much better for Russia since then. On November 8, the Kyiv Independent reported that Russia's tank losses were up to 11,330, which means another 1,330 tanks lost in about 9 months. That's better for Russia. It brings the monthly average down to about 148 tanks lost. However, those lower numbers are less due to Russia getting better at defending its tanks, and more due to the fact that the country is quickly running out of the mechanized units it needs to launch the types of full frontal assaults that were common during the first few years of the Ukraine war. Ukraine has been reveling in the failure of Russia's tanks. Many of the destroyed Russian tanks and armored vehicles, abandoned in retreat, have been turned into scrap metal or repurposed as exhibits, symbolic of Ukraine's resistance, the UK Defence Journal reports. For instance, some of these wrecked machines have been displayed in Ukrainian cities, while others have been dismantled by locals in liberated regions. Russia will be wishing it could reclaim those trophy tanks. Its current situation is so bad that Arena M likely wouldn't be able to help it even if its radars actually worked. Russia has been running on empty when it comes to tanks for quite a while. Back in June, Novaya Gazeta published a report covering figures provided by the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW. According to those numbers, Russia is down to about 46% of its pre-war tank reserves. That doesn't seem too bad, right? Sure, Russia has lost well over 10,000 of its tanks by this point, but 46% of its reserves left over must mean that it still has thousands more tanks in the pipeline. Not exactly. The remaining tanks in Russia's reserves are those that it deemed unsuitable to enter Ukraine in the 3 years or so prior to the ISW's report. These are the dregs of the armories, the tanks that need extensive repair work or are so beyond hope that they're only good for being stripped for the few working parts that they have left. Assuming these numbers are accurate, the ISW says Russia will be out of usable tanks by the end of 2025. So now we're starting to see that this prediction may not be unrealistic. On October 8, United 24 Media published the results of an open-source intelligence examination into Russia's tanks. Created by a group called JOMPI, the report claims that satellite images show that Russia's usable tank reserves have plummeted from 7,342 units to just 92. At least that's 92 T-72B tanks that are in decent condition. Russia still has 1,606 tanks that JOMPI says are in poor condition, along with 844 that are practically ruined. Now, think about what a working Arena M would have meant for Russia's reserves. Granted, we did mention earlier that even a working version of Russia's armor still wouldn't make its tanks invincible. However, it would still have slowed down the Russian tank attrition rate. Putin would much prefer for his tanks to be capable of destroying several Ukrainian drones before they're hit. That could lead to faster advances and less churn through the depleting stocks in Russia's tank bases. But no, after 30 years of development, Arena M is worthless to Russia. It's simply yet another of the country's advanced weapons that isn't capable of dealing with FPV drones that cost Ukraine as little as $400 per unit to build. The Arena M is now a testament to how Russia is burning through its cash reserves to fund Putin's insane invasion of Ukraine. And the more tanks that the system fails to protect, the more money that Russia loses. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Russia's economy is on the brink of collapse thanks to rampant military spending, rising taxes, and the costs being imposed by Ukraine and the West. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of Russia's latest military technology failures.